Well, my grandfather emigrated from Ireland to Nebraska in the late 1800s, and he first settled in Pittsburgh and didn't move to Nebraska until General John O'Neill from the Civil War came back from O'Neill. He had gone after the war, he went to Canada to try and invade Canada and win it back for Ireland for some peculiar reason. And the government finally said, General O'Neill, go home, the war is over. So he went down into the middle of the country and homesteaded a farm himself. And then he came back to Pittsburgh where there was a colony of Irishmen, and he said to these, being a storyteller, he said to these people, there's a great town out there in Nebraska, you should come there. And so they got in their wagon. My grandfather brought his mother from Ireland and his three brothers, and they got in the wagon and went from Pittsburgh to Nebraska. There was nothing there with the barn, but a barn with the name O'Neill painted on it. So General John had kind of hoodwinked them. But my grandfather homesteaded there, and a homestead is, as you probably know, a square mile of land. You got a quarter section of that, and on the corner of that land, he built his house, and he built a schoolhouse for his kids to go to school. In an effort to get people to move to the Midwest, the government created the Homestead Act, which gave each person who settled there a claim of a quarter section of land. If you took a square mile and divided it up into 4 pieces, the quarter section is what they got for free, as long as they laid claim to it and they built a house on it. So my grandfather did that after he came with General John O'Neill, and he built his own house, which I grew up in, and the schoolhouse. He wanted his kids to have a school. No one else wanted to give up any part of their land to build a school on. They wanted to farm it all, but he gave up and he built his little schoolhouse there. He really believed in education, and in 1920 sent his daughters to college, a poor farmer from Nebraska, literally unheard of, but it was very important to him. So my becoming a teacher later on in life would have been an important issue for him. He built the schoolhouse, and my father went to school there, and I went to school there, and I went back and I taught school in that little schoolhouse. That little schoolhouse was important to us because the teacher then, we were the closest family to the school, so the teacher lived with us. During the winter when the roads were bad, she would live with us during the week, and then she'd go home on the weekends. So we had a very close ties with that little schoolhouse. It no longer stands, but I treasured the years that I taught there, and I went on to become a teacher, which was very important to my grandpa. The farm was important to us, of course, because it was our livelihood. I don't know how we survived economically because there was very little money in those days. A few years after my father was born, my father was the youngest of 4 kids, and a few years after he was born, his uncle, my grandfather's brother, was killed in a horse runaway accident. And being what neighbors did, he took those kids in as well. So my father was raised in a family of his own 4 brothers and sisters and 3 cousins that came to live with him. So we had a very difficult economic background, I'm sure, but we never felt deprived of anything. And having that schoolhouse and that farmstead there with all the neighbors who supported each other was a really important issue. It was very important for people to be giving and caring, very different than the world today. Our communication with the world was limited. We didn't have iPads and all those things then. We had a newspaper that came 3 times a week, and we were blessed to have that. We used to send a letter with a postage stamp on it that cost 3 cents, and it would take a week to get somewhere. Today we have to have communication in 30 seconds. So it's a whole different world today. But that farm background, the farmhouse that he built, that he raised his kids and that I grew up in as well, still stands. No one lives there because you can't make a living farming. Unfortunately, although they worked that land all the time, they would never have put it in idle acres, which the government pays people now not to farm their land. So it is sold to a neighboring farmer who does exactly that. It's unfortunate, but that's the way it is these days. So, as we grew older, my father was a very successful farmer, and he bought quarter sections of land around him. So by the time he died, he had nearly 1,000 acres of land from that 160-acre homestead. So we lived comfortably. He sent us to private boarding school, and it was a really great part of the world to grow up in. But during the growing up years, he had economic problems as well. And during the Depression and Prohibition, there were neighbors that had neighboring stills, and my father used to make extra money by running the whiskey from those stills, and that's how he made his money, his little extra money. So he had a very peculiar background in terms of that. We had one neighboring farmer who had a still, and he had, I think, 7 children. His wife had died, and he had no way to make any money, but he had this still, so that's what's supporting those kids. And the revenuers found out about it, apparently, in this area, and so they came to close it down. And all the farmers in the area came with their shotguns And they surrounded the revenuers and they said, you have two choices. You can walk out of here and forget that you ever saw this place, or you can try to report it. They left, and nobody ever heard from them again. So this was the town that actually, the lawyer who tried successfully Al Capone grew up in my hometown. Bill Freilich was a very successful lawyer. He used to travel to Chicago once a week by train so that his family would be in a safe place. He'd go to Sioux City and then on to Chicago by train every week during those trials. And so I grew up with his kids. I grew up with General O'Neill's grandkids, so all of those people are near and dear to the history of the Midwest. I have kind of a funny job. I am a color consultant, and what I do is help people find something very personal in their lives to identify who lives in their house. I ask them to go to the closet, go to Aunt Martha's, find something that they wouldn't find in a store. And we focus on that. If it's a photograph, one of my clients got all of her grandmother's wedding pictures and we framed them and hung them in the dining room. It's a great history of her family. Sometimes it's a piece of furniture, but it's always something very personal. I have my grandfather's wedding picture from the 1890s hanging in my dining room, and it says hello to me every day when I come home. The schoolhouse that he built in my childhood, I had an architect's sketch of that, and that hangs in my office, which also makes my background very personal. I think everybody should have something in their lives that is a happy memory to greet them when they come home. And I do an interview with every client who comes in to ask them questions about their personal approach to color. We are privileged in this business to help people with the most private part of their lives, that's their homes. And I try and pick something out of that home that makes it feel very personal. When you step into a house, you should see something that I couldn't sell you, something that is so personal. So when I go into someone's home, I look for an antique, or I look for a picture of a family person, or something that says, this is who lives here.